What's going on, everybody? Thanks for tuning back in. Today we're going to be taking a look at how to manage a global state in React. A lot of people have already asked me to cover Redux and TypeScript together. Redux was generally the best way to manage global state in a React application before React hooks, before UseContext and UseReducer were available to you through the React library. Redux is a great solution, and if you're using it already and you're used to it, by all means you can keep using it. I'm going to show you how to use UseContext and UseReducer together to replace Redux with some of React's just built-in libraries already. I'm going to show you two different situations. First, I'm going to show you UseContext by itself, and then I'll show you UseContext mixed in with UseReducer. Now, UseContext and UseReducer by themselves can be separated. UseContext is really good if you have a small global state. If you don't want to use a reducer with it, it's not really necessary because you can still pass functions into your context. And I've done that before in some of my videos. And when you have a small global state, using UseReducer with it is basically just like bringing a gun to a knife fight. Like, you don't really need to do that. However, when you have a more complicated state and you want to manage it in one place, or if you have a couple contexts together that you want to manage properly, that's when you should be using UseReducer. That being said, I have a small example here that I've built. It's just a really basic shopping app. I just kind of whipped it up really fast. It's just two pages, a shop page and a cart page. On the shop page, we're going to have two items that you can add to the cart. And then the cart page is just going to render whatever you have in the cart and allow you to remove items from the cart. The buttons right here don't actually do anything yet. We're going to be programming everything from scratch. But I did set up this project so we didn't actually have to go through setting up everything when it comes to making our shop item components and our actual routing and stuff. That's all taken care of for you right now. If you're trying to add this into your own project, this should be really easy to integrate using this example. Okay guys, let's get right into it. The first thing we're going to do is create a new folder inside of our source folder called context. Inside the context folder, go ahead and create a cart.ts file. This is going to be what holds the actual context. At the top, we're going to import our create context from React. And we're going to go ahead and import the iItem interface from interfaces item. This is one of the pre-made interfaces I provide for you. First, we're going to make an interface that we're going to export. It's called iCartProps. And inside of it, we're going to have an item object. And that is defined by a dictionary with a key of type string and a value of an item in an array. Next, you're going to have an update items, and then that's actually going to be a function where items is of type, and then I'm just going to copy and paste the key string item array from above, and this function is going to be void. Next, we're going to do a const cart context is equal to create context. We're going to pass in the iCartProps. Then we're going to have the default items dictionary to be empty. And the update items default function is going to be pretty much the same, but instead of pointing to void, it's just an empty function. Next, we're going to do an export const cart context consumer and make that equal to our cart context.consumer. Do the same thing for the provider. And then export default cart context. And this is pretty much how we construct our context. So what's going on here is that our cart context is going to have an items dictionary, and this is going to hold all of the items we add to our cart. The key is going to just be the item name, and then it's just going to hold a certain amount of items. This is kind of inefficient, as you could just do a quantity, but I'm just passing in the actual item here so I know what I'm rendering in my cart page. If this was an actual complicated shop application, you would have a separate interface for actually holding the items themselves. The update items function is what we're going to be passing around to actually update what's inside of our cart. So in the cart page and the shop page, we're going to be calling that function to add and remove items from our cart. Next, let's head over to our application.tsx file. We're going to create a new state variable called const items with the setItems setter function. And this is going to be equal to a use state. And it's going to be an empty dictionary. And the type is going to be the same thing from our context, a key as a string, with an item array as the value. This is what's going to be passed down into our cart context and provided to all of our routes. I'm just going to copy and paste that because I'm going to need it again. Next, I'm going to make an update items function. Inside of it, it's going to take an underscore items variable. It's going to be of the type and then paste it in here. And inside the functions, we're simply going to set our items equal to whatever items we pass in. Next, create a variable called cart context values, or just values if you want. And what we're going to be passing in here is just our items and our function. And then inside of our return, we're going to do the cart context provider, and we're going to set the value equal to our cart context values. Now that we do this, we can use this context in anything that's rendered inside of the cart context provider. So let's go to the shop, and if you take a look here, you can see that I have just an array of fake items, and then inside of it, I have a mapping of these items, and then you can see I have a shop item component here. All that shop item component is just rendering the cards nicely in a separated component, which is kind of the whole point of React. But I just wanted to show you that that's actually where each thing is getting rendered. So we're going to be editing the shop item component, and inside of the cart page, I also have a cart item component. The shop item component will have the button that adds items to the cart, and the cart item component will have buttons that remove the item from the cart. So let's go to the shop item page, and let's go to our button that adds to the cart. At the top, let's go ahead and do a const cart context is equal to our use context, and inside of it, we're going to pass in our cart context. Make sure the variable you're passing into the use context is the cart context with a capital C. This is the default export from our context file. Once you've done this, go ahead and add a function to the button, the access its onClick property. Inside of it, we're going to have a function with no props. And what we're going to be doing is basically getting a copy of the current cart or the items in the cart and then modifying it and passing it back. So create a new variable and make that equal to the cart context items with the spread operator. So this is doing a copy of the dictionary. And right here, we're going to check to see if the items or your dictionary, whatever you named it, at that item.name exists. We're just going to go ahead and push the item that this cart is rendering into the cart. If it doesn't exist, you're going to set the items at this item.name equal to a new array and just pass in our item. Next, you're going to call cart context.update items, and you're going to pass in this dictionary that we just altered. And now the cart will be updated with our new item. Similar to this file, we're going to go to our actual cart page here. And first we're going to set up the page, and then we're going to modify the cart item to remove it when we want it to. So much like we did in the previous file, you're going to grab your cart context from the use context and then cart context with a capital C. Now we have access to the context because, again, it's being passed down from our application.tsx file through our provider. Next, we're going to check to see if the object.keys and passing in our cart context.items, and we're checking to see if that length property is greater than 0. So if we have more than 0 keys, we know for a fact we have an item in our cart. Using the question mark and colon operator, we create our JSX if else. Throw that your cart is empty into the else section. And now if we do have a length greater than 0, let's go ahead and create a new row. And we're going to start looping through all the different items in our cart and checking to see the quantity of each. To do this, we're going to just throw in a row here, and then we're going to map our object.keys cart context.items because it is greater than 0. We're going to grab the dictionary value, but this time we're going to get it at the actual value. So the value, remember, is going to be the name, or as we defined it before, the key of type string. So you let your items be equal to cart context.items at value, which returns the array that's being held by that key. If the items.length is greater than 0, what you're going to do is we're going to just render this cart item component that I've created. You're going to pass in the key at the index. You're going to pass in the item as the items at our, let's just say 0 array because we know we have at least one. And then the quantity is going to be the items.length. If the length is not greater than 0. So if it's 0 or less than that somehow, just return null. Now the next thing we have to do is actually edit that cart item component to have a remove this from cart button. So I've actually already set the button up here. We just have to add the on click. So we can begin to create our on click function. And again, it's going to have no props. And before you create your variable, don't forget to import your cart context from the top. Now that we've done that, let's just copy the dictionary over with the spread operator as we've been doing before. So here, what you're going to do is you're just going to pop the last item in the array off, and you're going to check to see if the length is 0. Because if it is, we know we don't have this item in our cart anymore because the quantity is now 0. And all you're going to do is you're just going to go ahead and delete that item right out of the cart. You're going to do this by passing in the function or the keyword delete, and then targeting the items at the item.name. And then you're going to pass in your items to the cart context.update items. Now all the buttons are working, and we just have to show some way for us to see that we actually have items in our cart. And what we're going to do is we're just going to have a little badge next to our little cart icon that we have in our tool in our nav bar. And it's just going to show the number of items we have in our cart. Nice and simple. So let's go ahead and create a count variable at the top with a setCountSetter function. This is going to be using the state with a number and the default value of 0. Also, make sure you import your cart context as we've been doing before. Finally, you're going to use React's useEffect lifecycle method, and this is going to be dependent on our cart context. So every time our cart context gets updated, we want to run this function to see if we're changing the count inside of the nav bar. Create a dummy variable for your count that's equal to 0. Create a for loop to loop through your cart context items. And simply make the count plus equal to your cart context items at the key value and just grabbing the length from the array. If your count is equal to your previous count, just return because you don't need to update it. But if not, we're going to set the count equal to our new count variable. Lastly, now that we have this count variable updated, we're just going to create a badge from React, which is the library I've been using for this. And what we're going to do is we're going to check to see if the count is greater than 0. If it is, we're going to render this badge. I'm going to make the color danger so it shows up as red. And you're just going to pass in the count. And let's start it up and check to see what happens. So we've started up our at. Let's go ahead and add to cart. You'll see that there's nothing on the cart first, and we've added an item to the cart, and it seems to be responsive just fine. Now let's go to the cart and remove one of the items and see if it updates. And it updates just fine. So our add to cart and remove to cart are working within our context or our global state. So as far as use context goes, if you only had items and maybe 1 or 2 other things in your cart, having a few items and some functions to alter them would be fine for a context. But when your state starts to get really, really big, it would be really, really good to use reducers, as they really help you manage the state. And especially with TypeScript, you know what you're going to get. So now that we finished using the context, let's modify it using UseReducer to get you set up for success. So first things first, let's go back to our cart.ts file in our context folder. Let's first create a new interface. We're going to do an export interface iCartActions. And inside of it, we're going to have first a variable called type. And we're going to have either an add item, and then we're going to have a pipe, and then a remove item. So these are the only 2 options we can have for our type. Then we're going to add a payload of type iItem. If you've used Redux before or anything that uses reducers, you'll know where I'm going with this. Next, we're going to export our interface, our iCart state. we're going to pass in an items object, and then let's just copy and paste our dictionary definition from below. So far, so good. Next, we're going to export a constant initial cart state. This is going to be of a type iCart state, and we're just going to have an empty dictionary for our items. So this is actually what's going to be creating our default state. Now it's time to create the reducer function. So the React reducer function is going to take in your state and an action. The state is going to be of iCart state, and the action is going to be of iCart actions. Now inside the reducer function, you're going to differentiate what to do by whatever the action.type is. So more than likely, any reducer you've seen before is going to have this switch case. We're going to pass in the action type. I'm going to define the three cases first. So we're going to have the case where we add the item, the case where we remove the item, and the default case. Now, if we somehow get to the default case, because Typescript isn't even going to let you pick anything that's not add item or remove item, we're just going to return the state. So don't do anything, keep the same state that we had before. In the case of adding an item, let's go ahead and actually define what it does. So we're going to let our item be equal to our action payload, and we're going to let our items be equal to our state items with the spread operator. We're going to check to see if our items dictionary has the item.name, and if it does, much like we did with the first button, we're going to go ahead and just push the item to that specific key value, and we're just going to push the item. And again, much like we did with the button, we're going to check to see if it's not there, then create a new array with the item being the first value. Now, once you're done that, you're going to return an object. First, you're going to pass in the initial state with a spread operator, and then whatever you're modifying. So now I'm going to just pass in my items, or right here you could put items : items. Now what this is doing is basically you're passing in your state and then whatever you're modifying off of that. So even if you only have one item, still put it in this way. Now I'm going to go ahead and cut the item and items definition out and put that in the beginning of the reducer because I'm going to be using those for the remove item as well. Now inside of our remove items case, let's go ahead and just pop off the items at that item name. And then we're going to check to see if that still exists by checking to see if the length is 0. And if it is, we're going to go ahead and just delete that key right from our dictionary, just like we did in the cart item button. Then we're going to return the state just as we did before. Now that your reducer is set up, let's go ahead and change this to iCart context props because we just want to keep that naming convention right. And let's delete everything out of the context props and the context. We're going to have two things here. We're going to have a cart state of iCart state, and then we're going to have a cart dispatch, and this is going to be a react.dispatch, and you're going to pass into the chevrons your iCart actions. Inside of your cart context, you're going to pass in your cart state. You're going to pass in just the initial cart state, which you've already defined, and then your cart dispatch is just going to be an empty function. The cart dispatch is going to be defined inside of our applications.tsx file. But that is just about all we need to do for the cart.ts file. So now that our context is edited, let's go to our application file. You can go ahead and you can get rid of the update items, the values inside of the cart context, and your states. Next, we're going to do a const cart state and cart dispatch, and we're going to make that equal to UseReducer. And inside of it, you're going to pass in your cart reducer and your initial cart state. And you'll see here that I'm getting an error with cart reducer, and that's because I accidentally named it card reducer. So let's go ahead and just change that. And now it imports properly. Inside of our cart context values, you're going to pass in the cart state and the cart dispatch. So it's already a little bit simpler. Now that's being passed properly down to everything below, we can go ahead and get rid of our unused imports. Next, let's go to our shop item. You can get rid of this entire function here because we're actually defined this inside of our reducer already, which is one of the beautiful things about using a reducer. And here you're just going to call cart context.cart dispatch. Inside of it, you're going to pass an object. The type is going to be add item, and the payload is just going to be the item that this button exists on. Similarly, for the cart item, you're going to get rid of this and do the exact same thing, except this time the type is going to be remove item, but the payload is still just going to be the item that this represents. Now, since we don't have our items directly on our context anymore, they're inside the cart state variable, we just have to go around and fix all of our for loops and our cart context.item calls. So we're going to go ahead and just add this cart state to any of the previous definitions we had. You're going to go to your cart.tsx page because we had some there as well. After you fix the ones in navigation, so now let's go ahead and run an npm start and make sure everything functions the same way as it did before. So you can see when I start hitting the buttons, the nav bar is updated with our new cart values, and inside the cart, everything is rendering the way that it should. So the UseReducer and the cart state are working properly together. So I'm going to open up the console here, and I'm just going to go ahead and add a console log to our reducer function, and I'm going to log the action type and the payload just so you can see the reducer in action. And after I do that and I start hitting the buttons, you'll see that anytime I hit a button on the shop page here, the type is correct and the payload is correct. And then when I go to the cart and start removing things, the type changes, but the payload is still using the correct thing for the items. So I know that's not a super intricate example, but that's the most basic way you can use context and use reducer together. It's really, really simple. It saves you the trouble of learning Redux, and it's already built into React, so you might as well use it if it's already there. All right, guys, thank you so much for tuning back in. I hope this works for you, and I hope you're able to use this instead of Redux. But like I said, if you still want to use Redux, you go right ahead. But it's like using Thor's hammer in a knife fight, okay? It's completely unnecessary when your state's not that complicated. Thanks for tuning back in, and we'll see you in the next one.